Well, good evening, friends. Welcome to our next episode on Expert Opinion. I'm Kris, and I'm one of the pastors at the Journey Church in downtown Harrisburg. And this is just a conversation series that we're having in the midst of COVID-19. Wanting just to engage in conversation with you, with others around particular things in the world. So far in our series, we've talked about immigration, we've talked about race, we've talked about parenting in the midst of COVID, talked about health in this season. And so tonight, I'm really excited about our next guest, Shane Claiborne, and looking forward just to our conversation that we will have around taking the words and the life and the actions of Jesus serious in our world today. So I'm going to welcome Shane to the screen. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Shane.
Absolutely. I'm pumped. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. I would love just some of our church members, some of the folks in our community know you, some don't. Just tell us a little bit about you, Shane, and some of your work at the Simple Way in Philadelphia.
Totally, man. Yeah. So I'm a Tennessee boy, fell in love with Jesus down in the hills. And Kris, this ancestry thing, my wife found out is now free. There's a free trial, like during the coronavirus. So we've been tracking our ancestry, and basically I've just found out that my people are hillbillies, literally generation after generation from the hills of East Tennessee, digging the bluegrass, whatnot. So I fell in love with Jesus down there, and I was raised Methodist, and and I still got it in me. I mean, there's so much of that Wesleyan fire, and but I really started to lean into the charismatic scene a little bit, because I wanted to be with people that believe that God is like at work in the world, miracles are possible, so I got rebaptized and got dunked, and became a part of this charismatic church. And there's still parts of that have shaped me, and I've spit out the bones here and there of of different the funk, I guess you'd say, of whatever part of the church you're in. It seems to have, there's some things worth clinging to and other things to let go of. But anyway, I like how Karl Barth said that we need to read the Bible in one hand, but we need to read the newspaper in the other, so that our faith doesn't just become a ticket into heaven and a license to ignore the world we live in. So I really became interested in studying the Bible and studying sociology and studying the world, studying race, studying, that. So that's what I did. I came up to Philly. What brought me up here was Eastern University, where I got my degree, and my mom was not really excited at first about that. She said, if God wants you to go to Philly, God can pay for it. I got like a presidential scholarship. So I remember when I got the letter, I was like, Mom, God paid the bill, so came up here. And then, I loved Eastern. I'm still, really connected to Eastern. But it was while I was in undergrad that we heard about a group of homeless families, mostly mothers and children. There were 3,000 families on the waiting list for housing. And so these families got together and they said, listen, we need to expose the struggle of homelessness among women and children. And so let's not be invisible. Let's not hide. And they moved into an abandoned Catholic church building on the north side of Philly. And we read about it in the newspaper. It got massive attention in Philly because they also hung a banner that said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? Wow. So, that was kind of the spark that created everything for us here. And then out of college, we originally were a part of a student solidarity movement with those families. But then as we, kind of things unfolded and we graduated, we ended up starting the Simple Way, some of my college friends and I. And that was, back in the 1900s. That was like 1998. We moved in here. You might be able to see it. I'll try to flip my screen to where, right outside the window there, that's our community. You've been there, Kris. So and we just been building a little village here for the past 20 years or so, painting murals, planting gardens, and trying to love our neighbor. That's what we said. Our mission's to love God, love people, and follow Jesus. And we're really inspired by the early church too. As we move towards Pentecost, it's that sort of early church where we see everybody sharing their possessions together, living the gospel out of their homes and dinner tables. That's kind of what we were aspiring to.
Wow. I just love that. Just the simpleness of that, right? To love God, to love your neighbor, and just to kind of live the gospel in a really, really kind of tangible way. But 20 years you've been in Philadelphia the simple way. Can you believe it, man?
I can't believe it. No, I love it though, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a wild thing. We've been, and it was funny because I was just telling somebody I've lived in like 6 different houses, but they're all on this same block. Because we get an abandoned house, fix it up, give it to somebody. And so we kind of, when we moved here, probably a third or half the block was abandoned. And so we just, now we're doing affordable housing. We're doing all kinds of stuff. So, but yeah, and the house that I'm in right here used to be an abandoned house, and Katie and I fixed it up in here. Got this lovely little wall that we made out over here, and whatnot. So yeah,
you've made it your own.
We have, yeah.
That's wonderful. Now, it's interesting. I love the Karl Barth, right? So we're to preach the Bible on one hand and the newspaper on the other. And if we look at the newspaper today, we're just hearing a ton of things about kind of the global pandemic that was being called kind of COVID-19. And I would love, Shane, just for how are you understanding all that's kind of happening in the world today? And and how's it affecting you? What's kind of, and how's it affecting your community in particular?
Yeah, someone said, I think very accurately, that the pandemic didn't break America; it just showed how America is already broken. And I think the people that were already struggling are even more vulnerable right now, as we see, how this is affecting disproportionately African American folks and people who are incarcerated. And so there's a lot of vulnerabilities that I think this pandemic kind of exposes. But we've been praying. This has been our prayer, Kris, is that we would be courageous and careful, cautious and courageous at the same time. So we've really stepped up a lot of what we do. I was telling you before, we got started at about 100 different agencies, nonprofit organizations, people that share food have had to close down. And some of that's because of finances. Some of it's because they rely on seniors for volunteers, things like that. So we've really, felt called to step up, and we're doing all kinds of food distribution in particular. We've got, we're doing it real smart. We've got like 1 hour times that 4 volunteers work at a time. So everything's like more complicated. We've got my friend painted on the sidewalk, I think 6 feet mark. So we will forever have little dots and feet. That are 6 feet apart, but but I'm just so proud of how our neighborhoods come together. We've got young people that are delivering food bags to the elderly. We've got a coalition in Philly that is bringing different nonprofits together. Every day we're feeding 500 to 600 people at those. So, and that's something that we bring our whole team, together to try to support all that. So, yeah. And we even had a saxophone player show up and play some smooth jazz. So we're trying to keep our joy alive, protect our hope, but there's always those folks that it's easy to forget, folks that are victims of domestic violence, folks that are in recovery that really rely on face-to-face meetings and things like that, I think we need to try to, as much as we can, be there for them in a way that's wise and responsible. But yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. And we've even said here at the Journey that the first people who can come use our building again is AA and NA, just knowing that we want to make sure that people have that support that they need. And I'll just kind of share for those who are watching, I didn't say this at the beginning, at any point, if you have a question for Shane or part of our conversation, we just want this to be a dialogue and community. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there. I would love to know, what's been the most surprising thing to you in the midst of this, right? You kind of said the saxophone player showing up in midst of one of your food distribution. What would you say is the most surprising thing that you've experienced so far in the midst of COVID?
Well, it has been pretty beautiful to see the creativity, like one neighborhood congregation that every night there's a huddle at 7 o'clock. People get on the screen so they can just say, how are you doing? Who's like struggling so that they can, I just thought it's brilliant. I mean, they're just a congregation, St. Paul's that's here in Philly. There's other neighborhood congregations around that are really doing a lot of beautiful work. Somebody just showed up with a speaker system on their car and preached a word on the corner out there. It's actually not. I'm sometimes a little leery of the but it was good. It was good preaching. It was about how God's good. Don't be God we're going to get through this together. We've been through a lot. So but anyway, it was good. So I think that the imagination, the creativity, the sense of like we want to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves, and so we've had birthday parties over fences. We've had like all kinds of stuff that I'm sure you all have been doing too. Just to try to be like physically distant, but not socially isolated. To still try to find ways to be connected to people, even though we got to be physically kind of responsible with how we do that. So
yeah, this kind of tension between being courageous and fun and also trying to be safe, like you kind of said already. I love that. Now, one of the things that I love about you, and even that you write about at length, is in your book, Irresistible Revolution, your time that you spent with Mother Teresa, right? Or now Saint Teresa. And I think that's so... She's someone who I often, when I think about living like Jesus in a really kind of practical, real way, I always think about her. And I would love, even for you, like, how do you think, and you spent time with her, how do you think Mother Teresa would be responding in the midst of COVID-19 in this season as well?
Well, the Mother Teresa and the nuns too. I mean, she had a whole network, a whole movement around the missionaries of charity. Just fearless. I mean, just fearless. I mean, I can remember when we were in Iraq. So I was in Iraq during the bombing, in 2003, volunteering in hospitals, trying to, be there with them. And we saw Mother Teresa's sisters, right? So I was in this worship service, and they have these unmistakable blue and white saris, the Indians wear. And so, I said to them, I said, well, will you be leaving when the bombs fall? Because I mean, there were over 900 bombs a day that were falling on Baghdad during this, the war. And I'll never forget, one of the nuns goes, no, the kids can't leave, so we won't be leaving either. Like the orphanages are here. We're here. I mean, and that was like so typical. I think that. And the other thing that I thought of during the virus is that Mother Teresa, they didn't have a lot of resources. I mean, they didn't have a lot of advanced technology. One of the really valid critiques of Mother Teresa's work is that they should have had more equipment. Like, some nurses and doctors would come there and they'd be like, these, in the home for the dying, which is where I worked every day. Every day people died. But it was holy work, and sometimes people would say, well, they don't need to die. They just need an IV or whatever, and Mother Teresa, she insisted that, our goal is not to keep people alive. Our goal is for them to die, with hope and with dignity and fearlessly. So it was really, really, I think there's some kind of equilibrium there, right? Like between like technology, but the simplicity and the innocence of what Mother Teresa did. I mean, it moved me. In fact, it's part of where we got our name, The Simple Way. Mother Teresa wrote a book called The Simple Path, and she said, following Jesus is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy.
Wow.
She used to say, we need to do small things with great love. What's important isn't how much you do, but how much love you put into doing it. So that's shaped me. It's really shaped kind of the ethos and, the charism of our community here too, is let's do small things with great love. So what's important isn't how many people we give food bags to, but do they feel love as we do it? Do they feel dignity as we do whatever we're doing?
That's so good. And I just like that language that is used, right? So kind of the easiness, but the hardness of that, and just the simplicity. And I would love to know, like, so something that we've been thinking about here, and even some in our own community have talked about how because of just the nature of the pandemic and all that's happening, there's a sense of our own grief and anxiety and worry and stress, right? And yet, like, we're still called to love our neighbors in a really profound way. And so, like, I would love just to hear, like, how can we love our neighbors in a profound way in the midst of our own sense of grief and worry and uncertainty that we're experiencing?
Well, one of the really core things that I see in Jesus is that Jesus is near to the suffering. I mean, it's the whole story of the incarnation of God coming to earth in Jesus, is that God leaves all the comfort of heaven and comes as a brown-skinned Palestinian Jewish refugee, and like every part of his life is leaning into the suffering. And not just coming to help poor people, but coming as among them, numbered among them, executed, a convicted criminal, victim of the death penalty, with someone being executed on his left and on his right. So, I mean, everything that Jesus embodied is about a God who knows what it feels like to suffer. And so when I think of, what happened on the cross is Jesus absorbed all the violence and pain of the world and exposed it in order to subvert it, with love and hope and forgiveness, even to those who are hurting him. So that should inform a lot of, I think we should have courage. We should also know that, like, if we have some really hard days, like there was a time where Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And, you can ponder that for the rest of your life. Here's God experiencing the absence of God.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a realness about that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, okay. So, like we talked before about the juxtaposition in our time that we can turn on the news and we can hear in our own state capital, you're in Philadelphia, those who are marching, the militia who's marching, with this kind of tension of things like Ahmaud Arbery and others in this time period, right? And I just want to kind of talk through and tease out this, like, juxtaposition of the two right now in this season. Now, I my heart pains, I think, for all who feel this sense of suffering, right? Like from the realness of kind of violence, but also those who are struggling to feed families, right? And so there's this realness to this juxtaposition. But like help me, like, you're smarter than I am probably, right? Like, help me understand, like, help me understand, like, the violence that continually plagues Black and brown men and women who are unarmed, right? And the violence and the sense sometimes it feels like there's a lack of sacred worth that's being upheld for. So, like, how do you understand and how do you come to kind of grips with it, or kind of understanding in the midst of the incredible violence that exists still in our world today?
Well, just as we're talking about the pandemic and the way that it's sort of exposing things in just a new way, things that were already true and were already there. But you look at these, militia groups, mostly white, armed with guns like semi-automatic assault rifles that are marching on the capitals. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them are yelling in the face of police. And you juxtapose that with the killing, the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery, or the death of Breonna Taylor as she's murdered in her home in Kentucky. I mean, one after another, this just keeps happening, right? And so I think that's there's a lot of things that I think we need to pay attention to. I think the pandemic is surfacing some of our really toxic versions of I don't even want to call it Christianity, because I think it's American nationalism that's camouflaging itself as Christianity, but it really doesn't look like Jesus. It doesn't sound like the Beatitudes. It betrays almost every part of the Sermon on the Mount. So I don't think we should call it Christianity. But I mean, it's some really bad, just some wild theology when you're like, I don't need to wear a mask because God's going to protect me, but somehow I still need a gun, So I hope that some of that theology begins to, we see the holes in it better. I think probably there's a lot of theology that can't hold the suffering of this pandemic, because you think, well, like, God must be in control. And that's why I think you have people that are going out without masks and that are insisting on trying to start worship services in physical space again, things like that. what I've been saying is, wouldn't it be beautiful if the church was the last place to open because of how obsessed we are with loving our neighbors and protecting the most vulnerable? So we should be the folks that are, really, really advocating for precaution, and that are going, and it's never okay to sacrifice lives so that the stock exchange can go up, so I think that there's a lot of those things that we see. But certainly when you talk about the lives that have recently been lost, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others, one of the things that I think we've begun to see is like how bad our ethic of life is. As Reverend Barber, a dear brother and friend, he says, too many people in power are way too comfortable with other people's deaths.
Wow.
And I think we have a lot of folks that are way too comfortable with other people's deaths. And that's where, the movement for Black Lives, I think, has been so powerful in naming that, exposing it. I mean, we probably wouldn't even know the name of Ahmaud Arbery if this video hadn't, come out. And I think it's quite clear we wouldn't have seen any form of justice if that hadn't happened, And so but the movement that I think is so important around this is to name what our entire history has neglected, to say Black Lives Matter. When our whole history and even our current reality would teach us otherwise. And I think it's kind of what Jesus is doing when he says, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who grieve, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers, is he's emphasizing the very people that this world has squashed and stepped on. And the irony that some folks, mostly white folks, are going to push back on that and say, no, all lives matter. I think if Jesus had said, blessed are the poor, some folks would try to stand up and correct him and say, oh, no, God loves rich people too. To say that black is beautiful is not to say that white people are ugly, or to say Black Lives Matter doesn't mean white lives don't matter. So I think that's where we really need a more robust connection between our faith and the suffering of other people, and being able to name some of those injustices. And certainly, the pandemic is I think exposing those who already were vulnerable and now are even more so.
Yeah, and so I love that, right? So that we need to have a kind of a stronger or a clear ethic of life, and that the churches, I love that the churches be the last kind of building or group to gather just to kind of continue to care about or think about the safety and the loving of the neighbor. But I think what's so fascinating to me is we know that Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second is like it, to love our neighbors as ourselves, to love other people as ourselves. But I think sometimes it's hard for Christians to truly love their neighbors, to truly love other people. And we begin to rationalize or justify a variety of things that don't look like love. And like, why do you think we sometimes Christians struggle to love, particularly our neighbors or other people around us?
Mother Teresa, she had a really interesting line. One of the things that she said is that it can be very fashionable to talk about poor people, but not as fashionable to talk to them.
Wow.
And I've come to think that sometimes our problem is not a compassion problem as much as it's a relationship problem. It's a proximity problem. It's hard to love our neighbor if we don't know them. And so, we're very good at talking about immigrants, but how many do we know? Let's talk about real people, not just these categories, or LGBTQ folks or whatever. We're very good at talking about people, but not as good at talking with them. And I think some of this is about fear too, to be really honest. That, there's that scripture that says, perfect love casteth out fear. And I believe that love and fear really are enemies. And they're like opposing magnets. They just can't occupy the same space. Love casts out fear, and fear casts out love. We do terribly irrational things when fear is what's driving us. And so I think there's a fear in the kind of white majority that's held the power and stuff for so long, and this kind of like new demographic of America. On the back of the first black president, there's what some folks call white lash. It's just this rise in white supremacy and white fragility. And, for many folks, I think it's very clear when they say make America great again, they are wishing to make America white again, right? That this really is about, because you think like for African Americans, what era of American history would they like to relive? What golden era are we going back to?
Yeah.
So I think there is a major racial fault line, but some of it happens because we're experiencing the world through different lenses. I think it was Howard Zare, right? There's this idea that like we're seeing the world based on our social location. We're experiencing the world through different lenses, and whatever we see out the window shapes our worldview, but we're looking through really different windows. And that happened for me. I think it's part of why I have a little bit of grace and patience on this. Is my high school had the Confederate flag on our football uniforms, on our walls, and so we were thick in the residue of slavery and racism, even when I grew, in the 1990s. And so when I came up to Philadelphia, I started to see the world really differently. I've seen some really, really disturbing things happen from police in our neighborhood. And that was like totally outside of my paradigm growing up. And I think that's why when you ask people questions like, does systemic racism, does that affect our policing or our criminal justice system? And white folks overwhelmingly say, no, you've got a few bad apples and we need to take care of them. But the system generally works. And you ask people of color and they say the exact opposite, overwhelmingly say, yes, systemic racism is real. It affects our policing. Let me tell you the stories, right? So, yeah.
Right. So I think I love the proximity language, right? Because I like Brian Stevenson, would talk about that, right? And Just Mercy, right? How do we get proximate? How do we get closer? And it's not a compassionate problem, but it's about a relationship. It's a proximity problem. And I think part of this is, we were talking before, is kind of the justice even around violence, right? And so I think that we are obsessed with violence, from video games to even. And we see that exemplified through policing. We see that exemplified through our justice system that isn't always so justice, but that it's kind of a different kind of morphed version of that. And so I would love to hear a little bit around some of your work around executing grace, right? And that's one place where I met you a couple of years ago at the Supreme Court, sleeping overnight with the Starving for Justice, the work to kind of work with the death penalty. So I would love a little bit for you to share about executing grace and our fascination with violence in the world.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. I think it's one of the most urgently important issues, this idea that of how we think about what it means to be pro-life, right? Because I used that language growing up, but I only thought about one issue, abortion. Right. And there are many people who say that they're pro-life that would be more accurate if they said I'm pro-birth or I'm anti-abortion. Because what you see is that you can be pro-guns, pro-military, pro-death penalty, and still say you're pro-life as long as you are anti-abortion. And that's the inconsistency that I saw in my own life. I was for the death penalty for, a lot of my life. And I had all the Bible verses that I was convinced, back that up. But what I think I see in Jesus, and I also see in the early church, is this incredible ethic of life. There's a great book I got on my shelf. Ron Sider wrote, The Early Church on Killing. And it's just the early Christians, the first few hundred years, what they said. And you see how consistently they spoke out against all violence. I mean, they did talk about abortion and they were very passionate about that, but they spoke just as passionately against the death penalty and against war, killing people in war. They also spoke against the gladiatorial games as this romanticism of violence, particular to their culture. And so it's that idea that I want to be pro-life from womb to tomb. I want to be a champion for life. And what I saw on the death penalty and gun violence. My last two books, Beating Guns is on gun violence, and Executing Grace on the death penalty, is that on those two issues, Christians have actually been not the champions of life, but we've been the obstacles. The death penalty would not stand a chance in America if it weren't for Christians.
Whoa.
Literally 85% of executions are happening in the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt is the death belt. My home state of East Tennessee still uses the electric chair. So, I mean, half of executions happen in Texas. And these are governors that profess Christianity, that are the most active executing states. And so that becomes problematic, not just as a political issue, but I think the death penalty, I mean, as you peel away the layers of it, you see that it raises some of the most fundamental questions of our faith. Things like, is anybody beyond redemption? Even all the debates of, race and how much we trust our government and all that stuff. Like, even if we know someone's guilty, don't we believe that where sin abounds, grace abounds? That while we were yet, I better not get to preaching, Kris. But,
Please.
I think that when we celebrate the death penalty or when we advocate for it, we undermine the very heart of the message of what Jesus lived and died for, which was to heal the world of this violence. And then on guns, I'll just be brief on that. But
please.
The highest gun owning demographic in America is Christians. White evangelical Christians, to be very particular, like very specific, like we own guns at a higher rate than the general population. And just to show you how wild it is, this is one of my props I've been carrying around, but my friend gave me this. He said, this is one of the top selling Bible cases in America. And you open it up and it's actually a concealed carry case, right? It's designed to carry and this is marketed for Christians to carry guns to church and in public. And I mean, when the Bible talks of principalities and powers, I think that this raises those questions of what do we put our trust in? I think, when you look at the cross and the gun, they give you two very different versions of power. And one of them says, I'm willing to die. And the other says, I'm willing to kill. And literally kind of the message of the gun extremists, not just gun owners, but it's the gun extremists, the NRA, these groups that say, stand your ground. It's a very different gospel than the gospel of Jesus, which is to love our enemies and turn the other cheek. And I think to not look lightly on, oppression and violence, but actually that the moment that we use violence to try to get rid of violence, we end up perpetuating the very sin that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden where Cain kills Abel, the inaugural sin outside the Garden of Eden. And we've been doing it ever since. So guns are certainly just a manifestation of that, a lot of people would say, well, it's not a gun problem, it's a heart problem. And we say it's both, and no law can change a violent or racist heart. Only God can do that. But we also need laws to change. God heals hearts and people change laws, and we can do a better job at advocating for life. And I'm pumped. I think this generation, they're tired of death.
That's right.
And 100 lives lost every day to gun violence. They're tired of, after every mass shooting, people saying we're offering thoughts and prayers, but no actions. So there's a movement, rising. I think of folks that care about other issues of life and still may care about abortion as well. But I think that that's why I've tried to focus on these other ones, because I saw there's that old Pogo cartoon where he goes, "We've met the enemy, and it's us."
Right. Yeah, and I remember reading Red Letter Revolution, right, and just some of your language around pro-life, which for me was, I think, an initial time where like the thinking about pro-life from being womb to the tomb. And even I'm struck by, even in this conversation, like two scripture passages, like John 10:10, right? The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I, Jesus, have come to give life, abundant, good, fulfilling life. And yet, like even like the woman who's caught in adultery, right? You without sin cast the first stone, and yet like Christians are often the ones casting the stone, and today it would be seen in things like the death penalty. But I want to ask a deeper question. Like, so if Christians are the ones who are propping up the death penalty because of the Bible Belt, right? Or white evangelicals are the ones who hold on to guns in the most way. Like, I think want to ask the question, why? Like, why are white evangelical Christians, the people who read the same Bible that you and I, like, how is there such a difference in interpretation or in the way that we see the world?
Yeah. Well, that's the $1 million one right there.
Right, right.
But when you're asking it, I think that part of what has happened, and this is why we're so passionate about what we call red letter Christianity, right? Which is referring to the old Bibles that have the words of Jesus in red, but it's going like the whole Bible is the inspired word of God. Jesus is the lens through which we interpret the scripture, through which we understand it. Jesus is also the lens that we're interpreting and discerning how we live in this world. And the problem is that a lot of times we've interpreted Jesus, and allowed the Old Testament or something Paul said to override Jesus. So I think literally one of the best critiques of what has gone wrong in Trump evangelicalism. And I say that specifically because I think that there's an expression of Christianity that continues to defend the indefensible. But the best corrective of that is Jesus. And I think that Trump is also a manifestation of some of those other principalities and powers, right? And it's been said that Trump didn't change America; he just revealed America. He and what we're seeing is, I think, very, very troubling. If you look at the Beatitudes again, or the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and you bounce those off of our administration, and not just Trump, but the policies, the things that we're doing. You're like, man, our country is looking more like the 7 deadly sins than the fruits of the Spirit, and that's a problem. So, but I also thought this is not brand new, right? And that's where, like, I think of the words of Frederick Douglass when he said so powerfully, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. You can't call one good and the other bad, and he said, I love, Frederick Douglass said this, I love the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Wow. And so that, so I mean, that's red letter Christian. That's like, so, but you look at what we've done, historically to African Americans, literally with the Bible in our hand, lynching folks and then going to church on Sunday, and some of the most atrocious things that have happened in history. Hitler came to power with the Bible in his hand on the back of a complacent and complicit church. So I think we've got work to do right now. But again, I think that Jesus is the beautiful critique of what's wrong. And I mean, even to this day, the KKK has a website that says that they're a Christian organization, has a whole part of their website dedicated to their theology. And you're like, yeah, that doesn't pass the sniff.
That's right.
It doesn't smell like Jesus up in here, right? So
yeah. And I think how troubling sometimes, right? And even just how sometimes troubling even Christian history is, right? Like crusades and slave owners, and even our own Methodist Church split, right, over of slavery and holding slaves, and bishops not wanting to, and that's why we had the North and the South Methodists, right? And so we, even our own denomination has its own roots that it has to wrestle with and repent of. But I think what's fascinating is you named kind of the politics of today, and I'm just going to say, like, the politics of the today, like, it's like madness, right? Of just the infighting, the lack of cooperation, sometimes the kind of complete opposite of kind of an ethic of life that's really, truly for life, a good life, all life, not just people who are certain, they live in a certain spot with the right amount of money, all those kind of things. And I would love, like, I remember reading your book, Jesus for President, with some of my friends, right? Like, I would love, like, what would be some wisdom that you would give us just to kind of understand the madness of today and the madness of a 2020 election cycle yet again?
Yeah, I like that part where Jesus says the wheat and the weeds are all growing together. I was telling somebody, it just feels like someone spilled fertilizer all over the garden, like the good stuff is flourishing and so is the bad. Like, our country is absolutely in chaos. And it's not just a political crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I really believe that this is a spiritual crisis. And it's why, we've worked together to try to host some revivals and to really bring ourselves back to Jesus again, but as I think part of the difficulty is that you don't have a party that embodies everything that we hope for. I mean, there's not a very pro-life party that's consistent. In the last election, Hillary Clinton was really hard for a lot of people to get excited about because she didn't have the best ethic of life on abortion, but she was also for the death penalty. I was actually trying to get her to come out on the death penalty, and she was for the death penalty. And of course, Donald Trump's, ethic of life is just a train wreck, right? I mean, he said I could kill someone on Fifth Avenue and still get away with it. So I, but I don't think that we're just comparing like apples and I think that there's what I think we need is a better political imagination. And we wrote this book, my friend Kris and I, Jesus for President, which was basically saying that old song, you can't say it better than my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. All other ground is sinking sand. There's a lot of sinking sand. And the beautiful declaration of the early Christians when they said Jesus is Lord was also saying Caesar is not. And it was a declaration of where our hope and our ultimate loyalty rests. And so, I think today we need to be politically engaged, though, because I think loving my neighbor as myself means caring about policies that affect our neighbor. That when Jesus said, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me.
That's right.
When you don't welcome the stranger, you don't welcome me. Like, that has massive implications on our immigration policy and how well we take care of people that are fleeing things I can only imagine, So these things matter to God and they need to matter to us. And I think we sometimes have these false binaries like, well, this is the work of the government or this is the work of the church. And we go, like, the world doesn't exist like that, like in these polarities, right? Like, God uses the principalities and powers, and so does the devil, and like both are in the church too. Like, yeah, but I mean, so I think like a proper question for me when on election day, is how can I vote for the person that's going to do the least amount of damage to the world? That like, I'm not looking for my savior. I've found
that's right.
Savior. But amen. I'm looking to do some damage control and to harness the principalities and powers that are hurting our brothers and our sisters and those we call the least of these. What does it mean to vote for them? Not just on election day, but every day. What does it mean that I want to make sure that I'm aligned with the people that Jesus called the least of these. And allow that to inform everything, right? Like how I think about, each of these issues and racial justice and police brutality, all those things, they matter because every single person's made in the image of God. And when a life gets cut short or squashed, that matters to God. I think God takes it personally.
That's right. Well, I had never thought about on election day asking the question, who will do the least amount of damage, right? And what a humbling kind of question. But I love that as a way of just often we put so much hope and trust in this governmental power that's not even meant to be our savior. That's not even meant to be ultimately the hope of the world, that we have that covered with Jesus, and how not to confuse the two of them.
Yeah, now you're getting to preaching now, so you're getting there. Yeah,
that's right. So right. So like we shared a little bit before. The Journey is a brand new church in Harrisburg City, and we're in a year old, Shane. It's been a kind of a wild ride. We're wanting to be a multi-ethnic church. We're wanting to be a church that's engaged in the city, with the least and the lost and the last. We want to be a church that's also for all. Like we've proclaimed this year, that we want to offer hope for all, and we don't want to kind of get in the way of anyone who kind of with that hope, and that hope in Jesus. And we're seeking to be justice oriented too. So I would love, like, what wisdom would you give us? What guidance would you give us? What would you want to share with us at the Journey?
Wow, well, I love it. It's a bummer. It's such a long commute, Kris. But I will be praying for you and cheering you on. There's a lot of thoughts that given what you just said. One of them is that Dr. King, he lamented that one of the most segregated hours is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning when the church gathers for worship. We end up kind of with that gravity of the homogenous rule that we're always, no matter who we are most comfortable around people who are like us.
Yeah.
In every way, look like us, talk like us, eat like us, dress like us. And yet that's the very thing that Jesus is blowing away when he says, even the people of this world love their friends and their relatives. Like, you're to love bigger than that. We're to love as big as God loves, and that especially means people that have been excluded or marginalized in different ways. And so at Red Letter, we sometimes talk about we're harmonizing but not homogenizing. So we want to sing the song of love together. And actually, the more diverse we are, the wiser we are.
Yeah.
And the more we reflect the diversity of God's kingdom. And I'll just say one more thing on that, because I think as we get up to Pentecost here, there's been a lot of theologians that sort of show the contrast of the Tower of Babel and of Pentecost. I don't know if you preached that one, right? But Babel was a monoculture, right? One people, one language, and they're scattered because they become very impressed by themselves, right? And they're trying to build a tower to God, and God scatters them and creates culture, right? And language. And then Pentecost,
that's right,
is this beautiful image that everybody hears the gospel in their own language, and it's very specific. All of these different places, rural, urban, like different cultures that are brought together, and you get the clear picture that the fingerprint of God at Pentecost is that that unity comes in the midst of diversity. That unity is not uniformity.
That's right.
And that oneness that Jesus prayed for, that we would be one as God is one, is not sameness, but it's actually this beautiful community that is better because of how diverse we are. So I just want to applaud that. And the other thing that I would say is that sometimes we divorce things that were never meant to be separated, like Jesus and justice, the great commandment, the great commission, faith and works, and they're like sides of scissors. They have to go together. And even historically, the social gospel and the gospel of personal salvation, like we end up like it's like the car runs off the left side of the road and we yank the wheel and we run off the right side of the road. And so what I hope for the journey is that you hold that dance, right? That God is personal and God is also social. On our front door, it says, "Dear God, heal all that is broken in our hearts, heal all that is broken in our streets, and heal all that is broken in our world." So we have a God that is personal, but a God that is also redeeming the world, a kingdom that is about life after death, but it's just as much about life before death. and the kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. So I think holding those tensions becomes really important, because there's a lot of folks that are really imbalanced on some of that, or they're overcorrecting what we've neglected. And that's what all the, the most powerful heresies of the church were, when we emphasize one truth at the expense of another truth. And so I think we got to just do the hard work of, and Jesus is the way to keep coming back to that, because you see those things, held in the perfect equilibrium or integration of them in Jesus.
Yeah, that's so good. And just like, I think what a temptation for us to begin to overemphasize one over the other, but just to hold them all into unity, that Jesus is kind of that glue. And that even one of my sisters even commented, oneness is not sameness, right? Same thing that you're saying. How do we have oneness, but not seeking uniformity, but seeking kind of a deep unity? Now, I'm going to remind those who are listening that you can ask a question at this time. We would love if you have a question for Shane. Would love to kind of engage in this moment. But Shane, I want to ask you my final question. And I ask every person who comes on here, regardless of the topic, this question, because it's something that kind of been resonating in my spirit. And I want to make sure that as we walk through this kind of global pandemic, I don't want us to miss the moment. And I appreciated some of the language that you said, that this moment just has kind of highlighted, that has been a mirror to kind of all that's been broken in our society, all that's been broken in our world. And we're just seeing it very clearly right now. And so I would love to know, like, what would be the one thing that you hope that we learn or that we grow in light of what we're experiencing now as a people?
Wow. Well, there's so many folks that have said, let's not hope that we can get back to normal, because normal wasn't working. Let's allow this space to invite us into a new future, not just to kind of pick up where we left off and get back to business as usual, but let's allow this strange space of the pandemic to make us more sensitive to the preciousness of life, to make us more sensitive to the suffering of others, because most of us know someone who's been touched by this, right? And so, let's come out of this with a deeper hunger for community and solidarity with those who suffer. So, someone said it's like the Lent of all Lents, like Lent on steroids, but where you kind of what the season of Lent often does is it prepares us to you give up things in order to sensitize yourself, some people fast and then you appreciate food, and you're also more sensitive to those who are hungry, not because they're fasting, but because they're hurting, they're poor. So I think, coming out of this time of isolation, hopefully can make us better people for community, make us, heck, we're probably not going to want to do a lot of Zoom calls. Let's do community better. Let's be more intentional. Let's let go of some stuff that, like my wife and I have just been getting rid of junk in our house, that if it doesn't bring us joy, if we've got two of something, or if we haven't touched it in a year, let's get rid of it. So but I think in some ways we need to do that kind of soul practice too, is let's try to we've actually, my wife and I have been really trying to regularly read and exercise and do some different things, so we're going to keep that going out of the strange space of the pandemic. But so that's some of my hopes.
Yeah, that's good. And Lent on steroids and a deep searching of people, or deep searching in our soul, but even kind of a growing into, you're right, I'm going to be tired of Zoom. This is great. I'm so glad to be able to connect with you this way, Shane, but there'll be something more powerful about kind of being in presence with people. It looks like there was one question earlier on that I'm going to ask it. It might be a follow-up. You may have already shared it, but I'm just going to ask it because she asked, and then we'll see if there's any newer questions. But Maria, she's a faithful person of our church, and she says, why does the idea and the statement Black Lives Matter bother people so much? I think you probably illuminated to that. I just want to kind of make sure we answer Maria's question.
Yeah, I do think, I think it bothers people because it's specific in a way that it's very interesting that the all lives matter has been the pushback. But if we can't be specific about that if we can't say Black Lives Matter, we don't really mean that all lives matter, and we can say specifically that Palestinian lives matter. And that doesn't mean Israeli lives don't. I think that like those are things that we can say, like that folks that are, have different disabilities or they're able differently than I am, like they matter. That doesn't mean like if you aren't in a wheelchair, you matter less or something. But I think we need to be very particular, specifically at preferencing folks that the world often does not preference, or even referencing folks that are not always referenced.
And it seems like sometimes there's a sensitivity that when we feel like we're prioritizing someone over there, that's at the expense of us. And often it's not at the expense of us, but it's in some ways because of power and privilege that we want to actually lift up those. We want to leverage the power that some people have to make sure that we are thinking about all people, or particularly those who are feeling oppressed in some certain way. Now, Mike, who is also from our church, he asked you this question. You see much more on the ground than most of us. What is something we can do to help an unmet need in this season?
Thanks, Mike. It's an interesting question because I think there's different ways that people can risk depending on, what their, how old they are, different, physical abilities or whatever. But I would imagine there's a bunch of stuff in Harrisburg area that's going on similar to what we are. So, I mean, you can surely support what we're doing at the Simple Way. We're sharing a whole lot of food with people, but there's probably stuff going on right there too. And here's the other thing: I just wrote some of my friends that are incarcerated, because a lot of folks that are in jail right now aren't able to have visitors. That's true most institutions actually. So you can write folks that are in jail. And we've got a lot of resources that are out there. So I think rather than like starting stuff brand new, like joining what people are already doing is really great. And using this time to organize, like for those of us that are at home, I think let's this is a very important season in American history, not just the election, though including that. But I think, the Poor People's Campaign is organizing what will probably be the largest virtual demonstration in history. We were going to do a march on Washington, but we're now doing a virtual thing. So that's June 20th. We're every week at Red Letter Christians on Wednesday nights, we do a thing called midweek mobilizing. And so we've got different guests on. And actually my guest this week, Kris, you'll like this, is Ben from the ice cream legend, Ben and Jerry's.
No way.
So, yeah. So but we're going to be talking about, different organizing that's happening. And we've had other people on there, Kathy Kong, Michelle Reyes, who are working on anti-Asian racism, the rise in anti-Asian racism that's happened during the pandemic. So check those out, too. That's something else we're doing.
That's great. Yeah. And I would just say, whoever you bring up something, we want to make sure just to thank you, Shane, for your time. And so if anyone feels led to give in a generous way to your work at Simple Way, Red Letter Christians, I'll make sure at the end of this to put in the link for people to do that, just to thank you, Shane, for the work that you're doing in your community. That really goes, it's not really for you, but really to go into the community that you are in relationship with, that you're in proximity with. And so I want to make sure to bless you.
Thanks, dude. Yeah, I always say that the Simple Way and Red Letter Christians are like the 2 feet that I walk on, because the Simple Way is to work right here in our neighborhood, and Red Letter is kind of changing the narrative of what, the priorities of Christians are in America and things like that. So both of those, you can go to thesimpleway.org and redletterchristians.org. And just grateful to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah. Shane, thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. Thank you for just willing to share hard things and be willing to, I think, encourage and challenge us to really take the words of Jesus seriously, and to allow that to be our center and our guide, rather than allowing even ourselves at times, even our own minds or preconceived judgments or thoughts to be the guide, but really ultimately to be Jesus. So thank you for this time. Thanks everyone who has kind of tuned in today. This has been fun to get to have conversation with my brother Shane in a concentrated way. And so I guess my challenge to all of those who are listening, a couple of things: to share this with someone maybe in your network, in your sphere, who maybe needs to hear these words and to be challenged, but also for us to be proximate to those who in our community who may need to know Jesus in a really real sense. And so thank you again, Shane. This has been a blast, man.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll be cheering y'all on and praying for you out there in Harrisburg, and hope our paths cross real soon. So blessings.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Shane. Thank you all.